but in any. Okay, great. So we're going to start with Prashant Subaidi. Please go ahead from Pfizer.
Thanks so much. And as the slide indicates, my only conflict of interest is that I am a full-time employee of Pfizer. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's public comment period. Pfizer would like to acknowledge the ICER staff and consultants and the numerous contributors to the special assessment of outpatient treatments for COVID-19. We appreciate ICER's efforts to seek input from a broad range of stakeholders. We'd like to offer comments related to 3 areas of the ICER review. Please note that the points highlighted here will echo feedback previously provided to ICER earlier stages of the review process. We appreciate that ICER has previously offered its responses and rationale on several of these issues, including in today's discussion, but wish to highlight our concerns again in this forum, as we believe that some are critical to the interpretation of ICER's findings. First, in its primary economic analysis, ICER has pulled data from placebo arms of different COVID-19 trials to generate a common usual care comparator arm. We believe that the use of a pooled comparator arm raises significant challenges for the generalizability of ICER's findings, as noted in our public comment on the draft evidence report. There are important differences across the COVID-19 treatment clinical trials with respect to patient baseline characteristics, prognostic factors, timing and conduct of trials, and in one case, event rates in the placebo arm between interim and final analyses. The impact that these differences may have on the development of the common comparator arm is not clear. In addition, ICER has elected to retain data from the placebo arms of treatments that have been subsequently excluded from the ICER review following FDA withdrawal of the emergency use authorization for these products. The net impact of these decisions has resulted in the development and use of a comparator arm that may not be representative of the population studied in each of the clinical trials, nor representative of the populations potentially being treated in the US today. In our comments to ICER regarding the model analysis plan, we recommended that for the base case analysis, ICER reconsider using this pooled approach and instead compare each primary intervention to its own placebo arm. The pooled analysis could be conducted as one of ICER's scenario analyses. We believe this approach would allow ICER to best represent the clinical trials as designed and would give decision makers the most accurate evidence about the treatments under review. Second, we'd like to reemphasize our recommendation that ICER elevate the societal perspective to a co-base case analysis for the COVID-19 report. Within its value assessment framework, ICER indicates that the societal perspective may be elevated to a co-base case when the difference between the societal perspective and the health sector perspective reaches certain thresholds. Researchers from Tufts have suggested that ICER's criteria for societal co-base case have likely been met in the current report. The societal impacts of the global pandemic have been significant and are likely to grow, given that COVID-19 is a relatively new condition and the full burden of disease remains to be understood. Efforts such as the Biden administration's National Research Plan for Long COVID-19 will be instrumental in adding to what is already known about the impact of this disease. By raising the societal perspective to a co-base case, ICER has an opportunity to both recognize the existing magnitude of the societal impact of COVID-19 and signal that there is much to learn about the potential value of COVID-19 treatments with respect to the overall burden of disease. This could serve to encourage researchers to generate additional evidence to further inform future economic analyses. Finally, we'd like to encourage ICER to re-engage with patients and their representatives regarding the impact of COVID-19. In our comments regarding the draft evidence report, we highlighted that ICER had interviewed 3 patients to understand the impact of COVID-19 on their lives and had only offered a narrative of one of those interviews. In response, ICER indicated that they had attempted to engage with several patient groups, but that these organizations had declined participation. We asked that ICER increase its efforts around patient engagement, as the long-term implications of COVID-19 infection are only now starting to be understood. It is critical that decision makers hear from patients, as well as patient advocacy organizations, about the comorbidities they experience following initial infection, as well as the after effects of the disease. Patient insights represent individual experiences, while patient advocacy organizations represent multiple patient experiences, and it is critical to capture both points of view. The challenges ICER has faced in patient engagement may be a function of the fact that many of these patient advocacy groups have recently been formed, and that these organizations may not be fully resourced to engage in an ICER review, or that the urgency of the pandemic has meant that their near-term priorities have focused on other issues critical to patients with COVID-19. Through continued engagement with a wide set of patient groups, ICER has an opportunity to educate these organizations and encourage greater participation so that patient perspectives can be fully incorporated into future analyses of COVID-19 treatments. I appreciate the time offered to Pfizer on today's agenda and hope that the comments offered here provide useful perspectives on the report. We look forward to continued engagement with ICER on this review.
Thank you, Dr. Subaidi. You bring a few points. I'm actually going to ask Dr. Winterton if you would like to respond to some of these comments.
Sure, yes. And first, just thank you, Dr. Subaidi. It's the engagement with you all has been terrific throughout this review. And
thank you.
your feedback has certainly improved our model. To respond, I think I emphasized on a few of these points throughout the review, and throughout my presentation. I know the pooled comparator is a sticking point. We think, though, that the differences that you note are the reason that makes it so strong, because these differences in trials aren't driven by the difference in necessarily trial design, but just the difference in changing pandemic over time. And so we think capturing that actually strengthens our approach. But it is an area that does continue to change, and we have tested extensively in sensitivity analyses. We did keep in REGEN-COV and sotrovimab as our comparators because they were the only two pivotal trials with more than 90% of their population, the United States population, which was our setting. And so I think there's even clinical rationale to, should those have only been our comparator? Should we only pool the evidence from those trials that have a larger proportion of our setting of our analysis? We included all of the interventions, and we continue to include REGEN-COV and sotrovimab due to its alignment with our population. The societal co-base case one, I think this continues to evolve as well. I think every single person on this call is aware of the societal burden of COVID-19. What I hope to still see in the ongoing evidence is, how do these treatments influence that? And so I think we can emphasize that, and have already emphasized that in our report, is to what you were saying of, let's emphasize the societal perspective, because these are important for future data collection. And we do include this as a societal perspective, and we can emphasize that there. And then the patient engagement pieces are great feedback. At ICER, we have a brilliant patient engagement team. I know they're watching this broadcast, and so I'll make sure that information is relayed to them. But yes, this is something we always try to do, is to incorporate both patient perspectives as well as patient advocacy groups.
Thanks, Mel. I think our comment on the pooled analysis, to your point, we've gone back and forth with this throughout the review. For us, it's a question of, when the pooled analysis is complete, given the differences in the placebo arms of the trials, what does that really represent? And I think your argument about it strengthens the overall perspective. I'm challenged by that simply because we have continued to see differences in the variants, in the rates of infection, right? So is the pooled analysis any closer to representing today's patient population than the individual clinical arms? Probably not, right? And so from that perspective, I would suggest that the most accurate way to portray the data is to use the individual clinical arms, because they are the data that we know well, and the placebo arms represent something akin to what the active arms represent. And so decision makers can understand certainly the limitations of that. And then if the pooled analysis is presented as a scenario analysis, that gives them another data point to present. But I think for me, it's about the presentation of the evidence and its influence. My apologies.
No worries. I'm just trying to make sure we stay on time. I think you made your point very clear, and I do hear compelling arguments for pros and cons. But really, as here, we try to go with the most generalizable evidence that we can, is probably a priority. I'm going to go to ask to move to the next speaker. Thank you for the discussion. And here, I would ask Overmitay to please go ahead and let us know if you have any conflicts.
Thank you very much. My name is Overmitay. I serve as the president and CEO of Solve-M ECFS Initiative. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated to improve outcomes for people with post-infection diseases. I do not have any conflict of interest to declare. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the special assessment, and for your acknowledging that in your report. And we particularly appreciate the opportunity to provide additional public comments today. As you know, the focus of our comments is long COVID, which is the term that's preferred by patients. Other terms that are used are post-COVID conditions, or the NIH uses post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. The acronym is PASS. But they all really talk about the long-term implications of the acute infection. As noted in the report, there is a very large number of symptoms that are associated with COVID-19 that may persist for many months after the initial infection. Many patients are not recovered by at least 7 months after the infection. And of course, we know of individuals who have now been suffering for more than 2 years. The top symptoms that people talk about are fatigue. That's the majority of people will report that months after the acute infection. Post-exertion malaise, which is the situation where any exertion can exacerbate the fatigue and the dysfunction. And brain fog, which is the general term for cognitive dysfunction. These are really the majority of patients talk about those symptoms. And we know that as many as 2/3 of people who have long COVID do not return to their level of employment prior to the COVID infection. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, just recently published their assessment that up to 23 million Americans have been impacted by long COVID. And frankly, we think that this is probably a very conservative estimate. The importance of this less visible dimension of COVID-19 was highlighted just last week when President Biden issued a presidential memorandum directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services to coordinate a new effort across the federal government to develop and issue the Interagency National Action Plan on long COVID and associated conditions. We also recently published a white paper that estimated that the total financial burden on people with long COVID is in the order of $400 billion in the US. And this is before Omicron. So given that there's such a significant health deterioration and related costs, any future cost effectiveness analysis of interventions, particularly in non-hospitalized outpatients with mild to moderate disease, should look at the potential to reduce this burden. The long-term outcomes are potentially an added benefit to the benefits of, on top of reducing hospitalization and prevention of death, and we must look at that. We're therefore concerned about your interim conclusion that and now I'm quoting, that should these treatments be used in lower risk populations, including patients with full vaccination, their cost effectiveness would be significantly reduced. We submit that the potential of these treatments to reduce the burden of long COVID must be studied. The absence of this data could produce a very significant underestimation of the cost effectiveness of such treatments and may prevent people from having access to them. We therefore ask ICER to include long COVID, the long COVID impact in your models, which is of such a high importance to patients and caregivers. As the co-founders of the Long COVID Alliance, we're committed to help you to facilitate a broader patient engagement in this effort, especially with when we look at underserved populations that are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and by long COVID. At the same time, we urge drug developers to include long COVID assessment in their studies, so it could be included in any cost effectiveness analysis to demonstrate an additional benefit. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make those comments.
Ovid, thank you very much for making these really important comments. And I think we all agree, no question, that long COVID is going to be a very important factor in a lot of the decision moving forwards and a lot of how we think about this pandemic in the future. So thank you for bringing the patient's voice here in the remark. Appreciate it.
I wanted just to make a quick comment. There was a recent paper, we did not have a chance to include that in our analysis. This was published by Su et al. That looked at predictors of long COVID, and one of the 4 predictors was viremia. And so, and this was irrespective of the severity of the acute infection. So if we now can consider that viremia is one of the factors contributing to long COVID, certainly treatments that reduce viremia at the early stages may very well have an impact on long COVID. So we begin to see some empirical evidence suggesting that a treatment of the acute infection could have an impact on long COVID. So I just wanted to add that to the comment.
Thank you. And again, highlighting we have to rethink about the outcomes, but we also have to validate some of these outcomes. So more research is definitely needed. Excellent. Let's move to our next speaker. That is Dr. Karissa Dianda from Merck. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So I am Karissa Dianda, and as stated here, I'm a full-time employee of Merck, and I'm the product development team lead for Molnupiravir. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss Molnupiravir with you and the ongoing engagement you've had with the team. As was stated and considered by ICER, Molnupiravir significantly reduced the risk of hospitalization or death with an approximate 30% relative risk reduction. I'd also like to stress there was a strong survival benefit for Molnupiravir, with 9 of the 10 deaths occurring in the placebo group through day 29. Additionally, there were other things that demonstrated efficacy of Molnupiravir that should be considered. This is secondary, exploratory, and post-hoc analysis that include things like COVID-19 signs and symptoms, both onset and progression, WHO 11-point scale, C-reactive protein, supplemental oxygen use, and hospital stay, to name a few. Molnupiravir was also associated with a greater decrease in viral RNA and viral infectivity as well, which is important. Among patients who had infectious virus at baseline, no infectious virus was detected in the Molnupiravir arm starting at day 3. And this has a potential impact on public health considerations. Additionally, recent in vitro and in vivo data has shown that Molnupiravir is active against Omicron isolates, and this includes BA2. Molnupiravir has no known drug-drug interactions, which is important consideration, and as well as a well-tolerated treatment that can be given at home. So all of these things in consideration, it really reinforces the potential of Molnupiravir as part of the solution for the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to the ongoing collaboration.
Thank you, Karissa, for being with us today and had these comments. I think this brings us to kind of the end of this section, and we're maybe finishing a few minutes early.
Yep, that's just fine. Thank you, everybody. Public commenters, we really appreciate your participation. And some of these issues, I'm sure, will bubble back up as we deliberate further and through to the policy roundtable. So we are going to take a lunch break now, and the meeting will resume at 12:45 Central Time or 1:45 Eastern. So we will see the CEPAC, and we'll come back for the votes and at that point. See you then.